So let's get in the passage today. We're continuing our study on the crossroads, and I'm calling this one the royal pressure. This is going to be Matthew chapter 27. We're going to be looking at verses 11 through 26, but we're going to be looking at all the Gospels. And so I'm going to read that passage pretty soon. I'll probably make reference to it later because we went way over in first service. So if you'll just trust me and you can read some of that on your own and trust that I'm going to be true to the word, like that will be helpful. And some of the other passages we'll add in, we'll kind of read about that as well. But one of the things that we celebrate today is Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is unique because it's the day that we read that Jesus came into the city. He was riding on the donkey. We read that they were waving palm branches and they were talking and praising him about coming in, which is just this complete joyous celebration that I think all of us are willing to sit in. But then, throughout the course of the week, all of a sudden, all those kind of praiseworthy statements really changed to vulgar, more, let's crucify him, let's get him. And that whole crowd changes on him. Now, I don't know about you, but there have been times that I've been in certain crowds. And again, I'm a big sports guy, so it's probably one of the analogies I use a lot. But there's something about going to a sporting event and seeing all the fanfare that comes along with it. You know, whether it's a high school game or college game, I love going to the High State Buckeyes and seeing the band come out and do their thing. And people get so excited about that, but it's like, it's pumping us up. It's getting us ready for the game. Even in high school, they come out, they play the fight songs. You deal with your alma mater and you take time to do the flag and the national anthem. And all that stuff just pours into this whole thing. And there's all that excitement. And at the end of the day, you think, man, our team's got a chance. Like when we go in here, we are expecting this team to win. But it's amazing how you can go in with all that excitement, and then all of a sudden you start getting in the game, and there's a couple calls that don't go your way, and all of a sudden you as a fan, you just start getting a little bit more tense. You feel a little bit more pressure, and you start yelling things. You're yelling to the ref. You're yelling to one another. Things start to intensify a little bit. All of a sudden, a couple plays don't go the way that you wanted them to. Somebody drops the ball, somebody makes a mistake, and all of a sudden, all these fans that were praising all these people coming in, they sort of now turning on the team, or they're sort of turning on the coaches, and they're getting a little bit more aggravated. And then all of a sudden, you can tell because even in these big moments, all those people who are actually playing the game, they begin to feel the pressure of the crowd, and all of a sudden they start making more and more mistakes because all of a sudden they feel the immense amount of weight that is on there, and all of a sudden it's, you know what I mean, everybody kind of loses it in the moment. And I think that all of us, even though we understand that sports analogy, I think that we have the same things that go along even in our own lives. You know, there are those moments when we're really excited about something we're stepping into. So I even joked this morning, like, when, my wife and I first got married, man, it was fantastic, right? I mean, we're stepping into this new relationship. She's looking at me and think, I get to spend the rest of my life with Chuck. Like, how awesome is that, right? So some of you are laughing. Like, I don't think it's funny, but she gets to step in this moment, right? And, we have that surge of just like, man, we get to be with each other for the rest of our lives. And even though we're excited about that, man, that can change, right? Within a year, a little bit longer, all of a sudden that was like, we got to spend the rest of our lives together. And all of a sudden it's like little things will come in the relationship it just kind of intensifies the pressure, right? You start having kids and you might disagree on how you should raise those kids, and you find out that they're going to push your buttons, and it provides a little bit of pressure on the relationship. All of a sudden you have all these expenses and stuff, and you think the money should go one place, they think the money should go one place, and all of a sudden you feel the pressure of jobs and sustaining money and stuff, and that adds into it, All of a sudden you find out that you've been putting the toilet paper wrong on the roll for the last 10, 20 years, 10 years, like I've been, like I married at 10. That was crazy, okay? But yet you start to feel all those pressures, right? And what I found is that, my wife said she married me because I was funny. Well, she doesn't think I'm as funny anymore as she once did, when we get into those pressure situations, right? So we get that, and it's not just about families, but we can have those same kind of things in jobs, right? We can go into a job and we can be really excited that we're going to get a paycheck and we get to do this job, but all of a sudden we get in there and little things start happening that provide us a little bit more pressure. Maybe somebody else got the promotion we thought we should get. Maybe things aren't quite going our way, and maybe the bosses have changed over us and we feel like they're hanging over us a little bit more, and we feel all those pressures. And what's interesting, when we feel those pressures, whether it's family, whether it's job, or maybe even in the church, when we start to feel those pressures, like sometimes we sort of lose control, right? And we start doing things differently or acting and responding differently. And so that's why I love this passage today, because I want us to look at like 4 different groups that are in this passage. And I want us to just sit with those different groups. And again, I'm going to try to fly through a little bit today, because honestly, we have something special we want to do at the end of the service that I don't want you to miss this moment today. All right? But let's focus in on this word for a moment. But there's 4 different groups I want us to look at. First of all, there's the group of religious leaders of the Sanhedrin, they've already tried Jesus, right? But there's a pressure on them that we're going to see in this story. There's also Pilate, who's the governor of the area. And Pilate is feeling a little bit of pressure in what's going on as well. We're going to see that the crowd eventually gets involved, and all of a sudden there's this sort of peer pressure, this mob mentality that begins to develop, and they begin to sense the pressure. And then you have Jesus in the midst of all of this, who we already know has felt pressure because we sat with him in the garden, right? And we heard his prayer. And we knew that he sweated blood as he was in this moment. And I want you to notice him specifically, because when everybody else is sort of losing control in the midst of all their pressure they're feeling, the one who had the most pressure on him is the one that keeps control in the moment. So let's read this passage together today, starting in verse 11 of chapter 27 of Matthew. It says, "Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' 'You have said so,' Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, 'Don't you hear the testimonies they are bringing against you?' But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, 'Which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?' For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting in the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message, 'Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him.' But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. 'Which of the 2 do you want me to release?' asked the governor. 'Barabbas,' they answered. 'What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?' Pilate asked. They all answered, 'Crucify him.' 'Why? What crime has he committed?' asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, 'Crucify him.' When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting, he took water and he washed his hands in front of the crowd. 'I am innocent of this man's blood,' he said. 'It is your responsibility.' All the people answered, 'His blood is on us and our children.' Then he released Barabbas to them. But he had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified." Let's pray together. Father, when I think about what was going on here and you get the significance of the story and see all the different players and all the sort of pressures they're feeling in the moment, I can't help but think that there are times in my life when I feel like the pressures build up so much that I don't want to respond the wrong way. So I pray through your example today and all that we sit with you in to recognize that there's a better way to respond, a holy way to respond, a way that speaks actually louder than words can ever do. Help us to sit in that with you in this moment. If there's anything I would get wrong in the interpretation of these scriptures today, Father, I pray that you would clean it up in the ears of your people so that yours is the voice they hear today, not mine. In your name we pray. Amen. So as I was studying this passage this week, one of the things I was looking about and thinking about is all of these people that have some sort of substantial power, and yet in the midst of all of it, you see like they are at a crossroads. And we talk about a crossroads as being when you're walking down a certain path and you have, a choice to the right or to the left, which direction are you going to go? And I believe that Pilate, and I believe the different players in this passage are facing certain crossroads that they're coming into. And I believe that the crossroads really are about the ability to maintain control. I think all of us understand that because there are things in life that we just want control over, right? You know, we want control of our family. We want control of our homes. We want control of our cars. We want control of... Some of you don't like to fly because you know that you have to put that experience in somebody else's hands, and you would rather be driving your car. You know that when it comes to your kids and they start making choices on their own, you were like, man, I wish they were still younger so I could make their decisions for them, so they would quit making these mistakes. And so we understand that ability to have control. When we're in this passage and as we get into it, we're going to see right away in these verses that there's the pressure to hold on to power. So one of the reference verses that says it a little bit differently and gives us a little bit clearer picture of the story is in John chapter 18, verses 28 through 32. And it says, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace, but they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about that kind of death he was going to die. So already the Jewish leaders are sort of giving us their premise, right? The Jewish leaders, they're losing their control of the people. Jesus steps in. He wants them to look at religion a little bit differently. Matter of fact, you remember on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, look, I tell you that I didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets, but I've come to fulfill them. In other words, I've come to give them a little bit more weight because I think the way you guys are looking at the scriptures and I think the way that you're looking at God is not as clear as it could be. And he felt like some of these religious leaders were getting in the way of how God was trying to communicate with people. And so from time to time he would get after them. And he said some pretty vicious things. He called them, you brood of vipers, which is almost like calling them the devil. He tells them, like, I don't like the way that you're exchanging money in your temple courts. And they get offended by that because that's a source of income for them. And they see all the miracles that Jesus is doing, and they can't perform those same miracles. So it just feels like Jesus is getting all the accolades, and they don't seem to be getting anything. But what's interesting is Jesus only heals to bring people closer to Christ. Everything they're doing is maintaining their control over people and is becoming like a barrier to people and God. And so Jesus goes after them, and these religious leaders can't stand it, and they can't stand it to the point that we're like, man, we got to get Jesus, we got to accuse him of something, we got to bring him to trial. So we know the trial exists, and then we know at the end of the day they accuse him of what? A blasphemy. In other words, of Jesus proclaiming the truth that he is the Son of God. Like, that's the thing that they were getting on him about. And so then they said, well, now we've got it, and because we want to keep control, like, we need to turn this over to somebody else. Because here's the thing. They felt like the only way to get rid of this problem was to get rid of Jesus himself. And they didn't have the power to execute him. But they were feeling that pressure that they were losing the people. So they took this idea to Pilate. And if you know anything about Pilate, Pilate was basically put in power by Tiberius Caesar. And normally he would spend his time in Caesarea, which was a closer town. But because there was a festival going on there in Jerusalem, he had to be there as a result. Now, as a Roman governor, your responsibilities are this. Your responsibilities are to keep things under control, to make sure that people are paying taxes, and then to keep the peace. All right? So that was their primary responsibility. Now, at these festivals, maybe when people have been drinking and doing other things, this is a time when revolts could happen and stir up. So it was important for the governor to be there during this process. What's interesting is this, and many of you may not know this pressure that Pilate was already feeling, because we think he's being pressured by this Sanhedrin, but listen, he doesn't care anything about them. He doesn't like them. But the reason why he's feeling pressure is because in previous years, the Jews had collected this amount of money, and Pilate went in and took the money, and he used it for an aqueduct. But because he used that money in a wrong way, the people it stirred them up, and they began to revolt. And because they revolted, remember, he's supposed to keep the peace, and he was supposed to maintain control. And since he lost control and he lost peace, his higher-ups got on him and said, this cannot happen. And if it happens again, we'll probably have to remove you of your position. So now do you understand the kind of pressure he's under? He can't have another uprising. He can't have another revolt. So he is feeling the pressure from these people who are basically coming at him, and then he's feeling also the pressure of the people above him. And on top of that, listen, his wife sends him a note, right? And says, hey, I've had a bad experience, a bad dream about this. And this is a bold move, by the way, right? Because this guy kind of ignores his wife, right? And so, but he's feeling the pressure from all these different things as he's trying to make this decision. And now what does he do? And so what's interesting, though, if you see the religious leaders when they come to Pilate, they kind of make some different accusations. Now, again, what did they accuse him of? Blasphemy. But watch what they bring to Pilate. Luke 23, 1-2 says this, then the whole assembly rose and led him off, talking about Jesus, led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation, 1. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, 2. And he claims to be the Messiah, which the word Messiah means a king. All right? So again, they had already tried him of blasphemy, but because they wanted to manipulate the situation, they brought up the 3 things that Pilate was supposed to maintain control over. First of all, they said, he is trying to stir up the people. In other words, he is trying to make sure there is no more peace in this land. He's trying to start a revolt. He's trying to take control. And then they accuse him of opposing the taxes, which again, Jesus never did that, right? We know that Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's. So they manipulated that as well. But then third, they said, and this was the big thing, they said, and he claims to be the Messiah. And by the way, if you don't know what Messiah is, he says, it's a king. In other words, they said that he believes that he has more right than the Roman government does. And so they play a little bit on Pilate's sort of sense of what's going on. Well, Pilate doesn't want to lose this control either, right? And so now this weighs very heavy on him, and it's a pressure-filled situation. What's interesting to me is, I think that all of us, like I said, I think all of us have a problem of giving up power or giving up control because it's a hard thing to do. What's interesting to me in the passage is this, is at the end of the day, the one who gave up power is who? Jesus. Jesus is the one who left heaven, came down to earth. Jesus is the one who went through all these physical things that he never felt. Jesus, at the end of the day, is going to be the one who takes up all the sin and shame of the world upon him. Jesus is the one who told his disciples such things as, hey, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. He's the one who got down on his knees and began to wash the dirty feet of his disciples in the room, taking the place of his servant, and was saying, look, this is what you need to do, guys. So Jesus gives up all this power in this situation. And by the way, which one speaks more directly to your heart? Is it the people who have all the power and want you to know? Or is it the people who get down there and begin to serve? And so Jesus began to develop his own voice in the situation. I want to challenge us that sometimes you and I have got to come to the place where we have got to be okay to give up some power in order that we can serve those around us. So then what happens in the midst of all this, and I think that most of us, if we were in sort of this problematic situation, I think many of us would respond a little bit differently. But I think when pressure comes, there's always this innate responsibility that I want to fight back in some way. And so it talks in verses 11 through 14. It says, meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor. The governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he's like, you've said it so. Jesus replied. And then he was accused by the chief priests and the elders. He gave no answer. And then Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you? But Jesus again made no reply. Like, that's amazing to me, because in the midst of everything that he is going through, in the midst of everything that he has experienced, it says in verse 14, but Jesus made no reply, not even a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now think about this. Everybody else is being stirred up, right? I mean, the religious leaders, they were stirred up because of things Jesus said. Even though he was speaking the truth, they were stirred up, and they came out against him, and they began to they feel this pressure. We don't want to lose our power. And so they're saying and doing crazy things. Now, the governor is sitting there, and I think to some degree he's trying to bait Jesus. He's like, because I think he needs a reason to accuse him. Because he's reading it, and he's like, man, I don't think there's anything wrong with this guy, and I don't really care for them either. And so, Jesus, give me a reason. He's like, don't you hear the accusations? Don't you hear the things that they're bringing against you? Because you and I know that if we are accused, what's our response normally? I didn't say that. I didn't do that. And by the way, here's some things that you need to think about. And we start bringing charges against them. And how does that go for you normally? You know, are people like, well, thank you for going off on me? You know, like it doesn't help. And Jesus knows that right in this presence, like his words aren't going to do any good. So he does what? He remains quiet. And the crazy thing is, he's ruled over cases like this time and time again. And he's like, this is different. Nobody can take this kind of abuse verbally and not say anything. But here is this man who is underneath all this pressure being Jesus, and Jesus doesn't say anything. So then in verse 20, in Luke chapter 23, verse 4 through 12, what would happen is then Pilate begins to ask them some questions, and they say something about this man being a Galilean, and he's like, oh, he's a Galilean, I'll send him over to Herod, because I can't find anything wrong with him. And so he sends him to Herod, and we're told in these passages that Herod is excited because Herod has heard about Jesus. He's heard about these miracles and these signs and these wonders that he's done. And so Herod can't wait to see him. And he brings him in, he says, okay, now show me some of those miracles, show me some of that stuff. And Jesus, again, doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything. Because Jesus only uses those sign miracles to bring people to Christ. Bring people to God. And so in that moment, Herod is like, well, this guy can't do anything. And then he begins to ridicule him. He begins to poke fun of him, maybe to stir him up again, and maybe he'll get a see miracle. Then he puts a robe on him to basically make fun of him. And then they send him back to Pilate, and it says that Herod and Pilate became friends along the way. But even Herod couldn't find anything wrong. And what's amazing is even though they're attacking him, even though they're coming against him, even though they're making fun of him, with all that pressure, that if you and I felt like we might go crazy, Jesus does what? He remains calm. He remains calm. And I honestly believe that his actions speak louder than anything that you and I could have said. If Jesus would have attacked them, if he would have went crazy, if he would have went after them, if he would have started sending the angels and say, let's go get these guys, they're being ridiculous and all that, it wouldn't have spoke as loud as his silence did. And it's amazing to me how God often speaks in the quiet moments of our lives. Jesus remains calm, which again to us tells us that maybe you and I need those moments where we remain calm. I always talk about the power of the pause because there are certain pressures that we overcome that we need to just wait a moment. And we just heard somebody talk to us this week, and they used the word wait as an acronym. And they said, the wait is this: why am I talking? And I think sometimes that you and I can get stirred up into a frenzy because we haven't stopped and listened closely enough to hear the real truth or the real evidence out there, which brings us to our next point. There's always the pressure to do what's right or to do what's easy. So if we read John 18:33 through 38, it says, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Is this your own idea, Jesus asked, or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate replied, your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done? Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me. What is the truth? Retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis or charge against him. You see, Jesus in the midst of all this is speaking truth. Pilate is trying to find the truth. Pilate at the end of the day believes that Jesus has done nothing wrong, nothing to be killed from. He's like, I just can't find it. But listen, sometimes there's an easier way to do things. And so Pilate, in the midst of all this, and we get into Luke 23:13-16, he begins to talk to religious leaders and the people again. He says, I've examined him, I find no charges against him. He says, Herod didn't find anything against him either, so we don't really have any basis. But listen to this, but instead of doing the right thing and setting the man free, he says this, instead I'll have him flogged. Why? Because he wants to appease the crowd for a moment. And he thinks, if I have him flogged, if I have him beaten, then they'll be okay with that. And yet at the end of the day, that didn't help at all. They still wanted his death. So what's amazing to me in the midst of this passage is that Jesus does the hard thing that is the right thing. And at the end of the day, Jesus knew that he had to die. Why? So that your sins and my sins could be forgiven. He knew that he would have to take the weight of sin on the world. And even though it was the hard thing, he still chose to do the right thing. And I have to tell you, church, we are in a world right now where the right thing is becoming the hard thing to do. We're in a world right now that is trying to take and say that truth is different than when you and I grew up. They're trying to say that certain things are okay. As a matter of fact, they have you believe that that we don't even hardly use the word sin anymore, right? And yet the Bible tells us specifically that sin is real. Matter of fact, you pretty much never hear the word hell in a service anymore. But yet we know the Bible tells us there is a heaven and there is a hell. And that if you and I don't get things right with God, that our sin will make us be cast into hell. Like, how do I know that's true? Because, as I learned as a kid, the Bible tells me so. You know, and so even though these things can be hard to preach, even though these things can be hard to talk about, like what the world wants you to think is that we don't have to talk about these issues because what they say is that Christians should be so loving. But Jesus told us this. He said, speak the truth in love. And so the hard thing can be to share the truth. But I share the truth because I love you. And some of you get that because you've had to have the hard conversations from time to time with your kids. You've had to have the hard conversations with your spouse and say, look, I love you, and that's why I'm giving you this hard truth. Jesus does the hard thing that is the right thing. And so as we move on quickly, and I'm not going to read all these passages, but I want you to understand that now as Pilate is feeling the pressure and he thought the flogging would help him, he now says to the crowd, you know, who do you want me to give up? And what you have to understand is in these passages, verses 15-23, Pilate is feeling the pressure of the crowd. The crowd is calling for Jesus' head. They're like, you can release this other criminal. We want Jesus to die. And he is feeling the pressure of that. And listen again, in this world, you and I are going to feel the pressure to become more like the world. And yet God says, I've given you my word, I've given you my life, I've given you prayer, I've given you time to spend with me. Like, you and I need to sit in those moments with Jesus and understand no matter how pressed we are by the world, no matter how pressed we are by the crowd, that you and I need to still live by his truth. You know what I think to help Jesus at the end of the day? I think that time he spent in the garden, I think was pivotal for him. Because as he was feeling all that pressure and as he was praying to God and as he was asking that cup to be removed, at the end of the day, he was resolved to do this. He resolved to do the Father's will. Because he took a moment to wait in his presence and say, God, where do you want me to go? And because of that resolve, he stuck true. You and I have got to come to the place where you and I have to be resolved in this world that the Word of God is still true, and that's what we follow. And you and I need to take some moments to be with God and say, speak to me, Lord, for your servant is listening. Jesus resolved to do his Father's will, and you and I need to as well. So before I call somebody up here, and we're going to go a little bit over like I warned you about, and if you need to go, I understand, but man, I think you're going to miss something if you leave. But at the end of this story, as we're getting into it, and as we read this historical account, we find Pilate that I think he's so kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, but he feels pressed by the crowd, that it says that he washes his hands, which is more of a Jewish custom, but he kind of gives into their custom and says, I'm going to wash my hands. And he says, and I wash my hands because I am innocent of this man's blood. And he says, I want to be clean in this situation. And I think there's a pressure to stay clean. Pilate felt it. He's like, you know what? I don't want anything to do with this because I think we're doing this for all the wrong reasons. I don't want to be a part of this. I'm going to wash my hands, and this is on you. And then, by the way, they make a powerful statement. They don't realize it. Then they're like, his blood be on us. And by the way, if his blood isn't on you, you're never going to be free from sin. Because it's by the power of his blood that we're made whole, right? But I want to take you back to the beginning of the story too. The Jewish leaders would not enter the palace of Pilate. Why? Because they didn't want to be ceremonially unclean. Because if they walked in that man's house, guess what? They couldn't celebrate the Passover together. By the way, think about how crazy this is, right? They don't want to be ceremonially unclean. Pilate washes his hands. When he has the power to set them free, he doesn't want anything to do with this. And at the end of the day, they're all dirty in their response. These religious leaders who want to be clean, they're plotting somebody's death. They're dirty as can be. And what's interesting to me, the one person in the story that is as clean as anybody, that has never done anything wrong, he's the one at the end of the day that gets dirty. And why does he get dirty? So that you and I can be made clean. He took all the sin of the world on him in that moment. Why? Because of his love for you. He wanted you to be clean before a holy God so that you could get to heaven. You know, it's hard to find people in this world that are willing to get dirty so that somebody else can be clean.